Sometimes the past doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to call you back. The wind moved low through the pine trees, carrying that quiet, hollow sound that only came from places long forgotten. And Ethan Cole felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in the air, like the world itself had taken a breath and held it. His boots pressed into the damp forest floor, each step sinking slightly into the earth softened by last night's rain, the scent of wet leaves and old wood clinging to everything around him. Beside him, Rex limped forward, his gait uneven, one hind leg dragging just enough to make every movement look like it cost him something. Yet he didn't slow down, not even once, not even when Ethan called his name in that low, steady voice he used when things didn't feel right. "Easy, boy, you need to rest." But Rex didn't listen. His ears stayed pinned forward, sharp and alert, amber eyes fixed on something ahead that Ethan couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't understand. The dog let out 3 short barks, spaced apart with eerie precision, a pattern Ethan hadn't heard in years, not since the desert, not since the days when every sound meant something and silence could mean even more. Ethan stopped walking. The forest seemed to tighten around him, the trees standing taller, closer, their branches whispering overhead as the wind shifted direction without warning. 3 barks, a pause, then silence again. His chest rose slowly as he watched Rex move ahead, pushing through brush and fallen branches as if he'd been here before, as if this path wasn't new at all. "Rex," Ethan called again, softer this time, more to himself than to the dog. The answer came not in sound, but in movement. Rex reached a narrow clearing where the trees broke just enough to let a thin strip of gray sky bleed through, and there he stopped, his body going still, his injured leg trembling but locked in place. Ethan approached carefully, every instinct telling him something about this moment mattered, even if he didn't know why. The air felt different here, colder somehow, heavier, like it had weight. And then he saw it. Through the trees, half hidden behind years of overgrowth and neglect, stood a cabin. It didn't look abandoned at first glance, not entirely. It looked paused, like time had simply stepped away and forgotten to come back. The wood was dark with age, the windows clouded, the roof sagging just slightly under the quiet pressure of years, and yet something about it felt untouched, as if it had been waiting. Ethan frowned, his eyes narrowing as a strange sensation moved through him, not quite memory, not quite recognition, but something in between, something that pressed gently at the edges of his mind and refused to take shape. Rex let out a low whine, stepping forward despite the pain, his nose lifting toward the cabin as if greeting something unseen. Ethan's pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus, the kind that came from years of training, from moments when nothing made sense, but everything mattered. He looked at the door, then at the ground, then back at the dog. "You've been here before, haven't you?" The words barely left his lips before the wind shifted again, brushing against the cabin walls with a soft, hollow sound, like a distant echo trying to be heard. Rex took one more step forward, then another, and Ethan followed, not because he understood, but because something deep inside him told him this wasn't a place you found by accident. Some places you were led back to. The closer Ethan stepped, the more the cabin seemed to shift, not in shape, but in presence, like something that had been silent for too long was slowly remembering how to be seen again. The boards beneath his boots creaked softly as he crossed the clearing, each sound carrying farther than it should have in the stillness. Rex moved ahead of him, slower now, his injured leg trembling with every step, yet there was no hesitation in him, only a quiet certainty, as if pain had become secondary to purpose. The dog reached the porch first, placing one paw carefully onto the weathered wood, then pausing as his ears tilted forward, catching something faint and distant, something Ethan still could not hear. The air felt heavier near the cabin, cooler by several degrees, the kind of cold that did not come from weather, but from time. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the shaded light, and placed his hand against the wooden railing. The surface was rough, aged, but not rotting. Maintained, somehow. That detail settled uneasily in his mind. Abandoned places decay. This one had endured. "That does not make sense," he murmured under his breath, more to the silence than to the dog. Rex responded with a low, soft sound, not quite a growl, not fear, but recognition, the kind that came from memory rather than instinct. Ethan stepped onto the porch. The boards gave slightly under his weight, but held firm, as though they had been waiting for that exact pressure, that exact step. He approached the door, his movements slowing without conscious thought, a quiet tension threading through his chest. Something about this moment felt rehearsed, like he had lived it before in a version of himself he could no longer access. His hand hovered just inches from the doorknob. He stopped, not from fear, but from something deeper, a hesitation born from familiarity. His eyes drifted to the side of the frame, where the wood had been scratched, faint marks, barely visible beneath years of weathering. Lines. Not random. Intentional. He leaned closer. A symbol. Simple. Carved with precision. A shape he knew without knowing how he knew it. His pulse slowed again. That same controlled rhythm he had relied on during long nights in places where every second mattered. Rex shifted behind him, then let out one short bark, softer than before, almost like a reminder. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound settle inside him. When he opened them again, his hand moved forward, gripping the handle. It turned easily, too easily. The door opened with a slow, steady motion, the hinges releasing a long, low creak that echoed through the quiet forest behind him. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the thin gray light filtering through narrow windows layered with dust. The air carried a faint scent of cedar and something older, something preserved. Not abandoned. Kept. Ethan stepped inside, his boots landing on a wooden floor that felt solid beneath him, not warped or broken, but steady, like the structure itself refused to give in to time. Rex followed, crossing the threshold without hesitation, his nose already lifting, tracking something unseen. The interior was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a small iron stove in the corner. Everything coated in a thin layer of stillness rather than neglect. Ethan moved slowly through the space, his eyes scanning every detail, every line, every object placed with a kind of quiet intention. Then he saw it. On the far wall, just above the table, mounted carefully, almost reverently, was a small metal plate. His breath caught, not sharply, but enough to make him stop. He stepped closer. The plate was worn, the edges dulled by years, but the engraving remained clear. Numbers. A designation. Familiar. Too familiar. His mind searched for context, for memory, but found only fragments, like pages torn from a book he had once known by heart. Rex approached the wall, placing his paw gently against the wood beneath the plate, exactly once, then looking back at Ethan with those steady amber eyes. Not asking, not warning, just waiting. Ethan reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the surface of the metal. It was cold, colder than it should have been. And in that instant, something shifted deep inside him. Not a full memory, not yet, but a pull, a quiet gravity drawing him closer to a truth that had been buried not in the ground, but in himself. Some doors do not lead you somewhere new. Some doors bring you back to the place you were never meant to forget. The cold from the metal did not fade when Ethan pulled his hand away. It lingered in his fingertips as though it had settled into his skin, and for a moment he simply stood there, staring at the numbers engraved into the plate, willing them to mean nothing, willing them to stay unfamiliar. But something deeper refused that comfort. His breath slowed, steady and measured, the way it used to when he was trying to make sense of things that did not want to be understood too quickly. Behind him, Rex shifted his weight and let out a quiet exhale, then limped forward again, his nose brushing along the wooden wall beneath the plate, tracing a path only he seemed to recognize. Ethan watched him carefully now, not as a companion, but as a guide, because whatever this place was, Rex had not brought him here by accident. The dog stopped near the base of the wall, then lowered himself slightly, pressing his paw against a narrow seam in the floorboards. Once, then again, more firmly this time. A soft, hollow sound answered beneath the wood. Ethan felt it more than he heard it, a subtle difference in the way the space responded, like the cabin itself was holding something just beneath the surface. He crouched slowly, his knees pressing into the worn floor, and ran his hand along the boards where Rex had indicated. At first, it felt like any other section of old wood, rough, aged, steady. But then his fingers caught a slight edge, a line too straight to be natural, too precise to be random. He paused, his pulse tightening just enough to sharpen his focus. All right. He whispered, not to Rex, but to the moment itself. He pressed down gently. Nothing moved. He shifted his weight, applying pressure in a different spot, and this time the wood responded with a faint click, almost too soft to notice unless you were listening for it. The section of floor lifted just slightly, enough to reveal a thin gap beneath. Ethan's breath caught, not in surprise, but in recognition, that same quiet sense that he had done this before, that his hands remembered something his mind had lost. He slid his fingers under the edge and lifted carefully. The panel rose with a low, controlled creak, revealing a narrow compartment hidden beneath the floor. Inside, the air was colder, stiller, as if it had not been disturbed in years. There was no dust cloud, no sign of decay, only a small, sealed metal box resting perfectly in the center of the space. Rex lowered himself beside Ethan, his injured leg tucked carefully under him, and let out a soft, almost relieved sound, as though this was what he had been searching for all along. Ethan reached down slowly, his movements deliberate, respectful, like he was handling something that mattered more than he could yet explain. The box was heavier than it looked, solid, the surface worn but intact. He lifted it out and set it on the floor beside him, his eyes never leaving it. For a moment, he did nothing. The cabin around him seemed to grow quieter, the wind outside fading into a distant whisper, as if the world itself was giving him space. His fingers hovered over the latch. Then he stopped, not from hesitation, but from a sudden shift inside him, a flicker of something that felt dangerously close to memory. A room, a voice, the same kind of box. He blinked, the image slipping away before it could fully form, leaving behind only the feeling that whatever was inside this container did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to him. Rex lifted his head and looked at him, steady and patient, his amber eyes holding that same quiet certainty. Ethan let out a slow breath, grounding himself in the present, in the weight of the box beneath his hands, in the stillness of the cabin that no longer felt abandoned, but purposeful. He opened the latch. The sound was soft, but final, like a door closing somewhere far behind him. And as the lid began to lift, Ethan understood something he had not been ready to face until now. Some secrets are not hidden to be protected from the world. Some are hidden to be protected from the person who lived them. The lid opened slowly, not because it resisted, but because Ethan's hands moved with a care that felt almost instinctive, like he already knew what waited inside and needed time to face it. The hinges released a soft metallic sigh, and the interior of the box revealed itself in the dim gray light of the cabin. There were no valuables in the way most people would define them. No gold, no stacks of cash, no objects meant to impress. Instead, there were items arranged with deliberate precision, each one placed as though it carried weight far beyond its size. On top lay a folded piece of paper, aged but intact, its edges slightly worn but not fragile. Beneath it, a small compass rested in a molded slot, its glass face scratched but clear enough to reveal a needle that still moved with quiet determination. Next to it, a set of dog tags, the metal dulled by time, the chain coiled neatly as if it had been set down only yesterday. Ethan's breath grew quieter as he looked at them, not in surprise, but in recognition that refused to fully surface. His fingers hovered above the tags, then stopped, a subtle tension running through his hand. He did not need to read the engraving to know what they might say, and that realization unsettled him more than any unfamiliar discovery could have. Rex shifted closer, lowering his head beside Ethan's knee, his presence steady, grounding, as if reminding him that whatever this was, he did not have to face it alone. Ethan reached for the folded paper first. It felt like the beginning of something, or perhaps the return, of something that had never truly ended. He unfolded it carefully, the soft crackle of the paper echoing faintly in the stillness of the room. The handwriting was firm, deliberate, the kind that came from someone who had written it knowing it mattered. His eyes moved across the first line, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The cabin, the forest, the passage of time itself all stepped back, leaving only the words and the quiet space they occupied. The message was not long, but it carried a weight that settled deep into his chest, the kind of weight that did not come from information, but from truth. It spoke of a place chosen not by chance, but by necessity, of a man who had come here once before, not to hide, but to remember. It spoke of a mission that had never been recorded, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that did not fit into reports or files. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes slowing over each sentence as fragments of something long buried began to stir beneath the surface of his thoughts. A structure, a storm, a decision made in silence. He blinked, the images slipping again before they could fully form, but leaving behind a feeling that was unmistakable. This was not a story he was reading. It was a story he had lived. He lowered the paper slowly, his gaze shifting to the compass. The needle trembled slightly, then settled, pointing not north, but toward the wall where the metal plate had been mounted. Ethan frowned, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he understood, but the two did not align. Rex lifted his head and followed Ethan's gaze, then let out a soft exhale, as though confirming something only he could sense. Ethan reached for the compass, lifting it from the box. It felt warm in his hand, despite the cold air of the cabin, as if it had been waiting for his touch. The needle shifted again, steady, unwavering, pointing in the same direction. Not north, not south, something else, something specific. Ethan turned slightly, aligning himself with the direction indicated, and his eyes landed on the far wall, just to the right of where the metal plate hung. At first, there was nothing unusual, just wood, aged and quiet like the rest of the cabin. But as he stepped closer, the light changed, revealing a faint outline, a shape just beneath the surface, too subtle to notice unless you were looking for it. A second compartment, hidden even deeper than the first. Ethan felt a slow, steady realization settle into him, not rushed, not forced, but certain. The box had not been the discovery. It had been the introduction. Rex rose carefully, favoring his injured leg, and moved toward the wall, stopping just short of it. He did not paw at it this time. He simply stood there, waiting, his presence calm, as if the next step belonged to Ethan alone. And for the first time since stepping into the cabin, Ethan understood that whatever had been hidden here was not just meant to be found. It was meant to be remembered, piece by piece, until the truth no longer felt like something lost, but something returned. The faint outline in the wall became clearer the longer Ethan looked at it, not because it changed, but because his eyes adjusted to something deeper than light, something that felt like recognition rather than discovery. He stepped closer, the wooden floor steady beneath him, and raised his hand toward the surface. The grain of the wood shifted subtly under his fingertips, a slight variation in texture that would have gone unnoticed to anyone who did not know what they were looking for. But Ethan's hand paused, hovering just inches away, as a quiet pressure built in his chest, the kind that came from standing on the edge of something that mattered. Behind him, Rex remained still, his breathing slow, controlled, his presence no longer urging but simply supporting, as if he had brought Ethan exactly where he needed to be and now trusted him to continue on his own. Ethan pressed his palm flat against the wall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, there was a shift, a soft internal release, like a mechanism responding not to force, but to familiarity. A narrow section of the wall gave way slightly, opening just enough to reveal a hidden seam. Ethan exhaled, not in surprise, but in quiet acknowledgement, as though something inside him had been waiting for that exact response. He adjusted his grip and pulled gently. The panel opened outward with a controlled motion, revealing a second compartment, deeper and more carefully concealed than the first. The air inside felt different, still and preserved, untouched by time in a way that made the rest of the cabin feel almost temporary by comparison. There was only one item inside. A long, rectangular case, matte black, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a small indentation near the center, shaped precisely to fit a hand. Ethan stared at it, a subtle tension tightening his shoulders. The simplicity of it made it heavier, not physically, but in meaning. This was not something forgotten. This was something kept. He reached in slowly and lifted the case out. It was heavier than expected, solid, balanced, the kind of weight that suggested purpose rather than decoration. He set it carefully on the table, the wood beneath it absorbing the impact with a low, steady sound. For a moment, he did not move. The silence around him deepened, the forest outside fading into a distant hush, as if the world itself was waiting again. His eyes drifted briefly to Rex, who met his gaze with quiet steadiness, his amber eyes reflecting not curiosity, but understanding. Ethan nodded once, a small, almost unconscious gesture, then turned his attention back to the case. His hand hovered over the indentation, the shape matching his palm with unsettling precision. He hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of what this meant. Nothing about this place had been random. Every step, every detail, every hidden compartment had led here. To this. He placed his hand into the indentation. The fit was exact. For a second, nothing happened. Then a soft internal click echoed through the case, followed by a subtle vibration that traveled up through his fingers, steady and controlled, like a system coming back to life after a long silence. Ethan's breath slowed as the lid released automatically, lifting just enough to allow him to open it fully. Inside, the contents were arranged with the same deliberate care as everything else he had found, but this time, there was no ambiguity. At the center lay a sealed envelope, thicker than the first, its surface marked with a single line written in the same steady hand. Ethan's eyes fixed on it, the words pulling at something deep within him before he even fully read them. Beneath the envelope rested a set of documents, bound together, official in appearance, their edges crisp despite the years they must have spent hidden. And beside them, a small metallic key, its surface worn just enough to suggest it had been used, but not recently. Ethan reached for the envelope, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as though he understood that once this was opened, something would shift in a way that could not be undone. His fingers brushed the paper, and in that instant, a fragment of memory pressed forward again, clearer this time, not an image, but a feeling, a decision, a promise made in silence. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself, then opened them again and read the line written across the front. If you are reading this, it means you found your way back. The words settled into him with a quiet certainty, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. This was never about finding something new. This was about returning to something he had once chosen to leave behind. Rex lowered himself slowly to the floor beside the table, his body relaxing for the first time since they had entered the cabin, as if the journey he had been guiding was nearing its end. Ethan held the envelope in both hands, feeling its weight, its purpose, and understood something he had been resisting until now. Some paths are not meant to be discovered. They are meant to be remembered, one step at a time, until you are ready to walk them again. The words on the envelope did not feel like ink on paper. They felt like something spoken directly into the quiet space of Ethan's mind, steady and certain, as if they had been waiting not for years, but for the exact moment he was ready to understand them. He stood there for a long time without moving, the envelope resting in his hands, his fingers lightly pressing against its edges as though testing its reality. The cabin remained silent around him, the faint creak of wood and distant whisper of wind blending into something almost rhythmic, almost intentional. Rex lay beside the table, his breathing slow and even now, the tension that had carried him through the forest finally easing, as if the purpose that had guided him was no longer ahead, but already fulfilled. Ethan lowered himself into the chair with measured care, the old wood supporting his weight with a quiet strength that matched the rest of the place. He turned the envelope over once, then back again, his eyes tracing the handwriting as if it might shift or reveal something new if he looked long enough. But it did not change. It remained simple, direct, patient. He slid his finger under the seal and opened it slowly, the soft tear of paper sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. Inside was a single letter, folded with the same deliberate precision as everything else he had found. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. The handwriting was unmistakably the same, steady and grounded, but the tone carried something deeper, something that felt closer than distance should have allowed. It spoke without introduction, without explanation, as though the person writing it had known there would be no need for either. It spoke of a man who had come to this cabin not by accident, but by choice, a man who had needed a place where memory could settle without being forced, where silence could do the work that words could not. It spoke of a mission that had never been written down, not because it was hidden, but because it was never meant to belong to records. Ethan's eyes moved slower now, each line pulling something from him, not all at once, but in small, steady pieces. A location, a signal, a moment when everything had narrowed to a single decision that no one else would ever fully understand. He felt it then, not as a full memory, but as a weight in his chest, a recognition that did not need images to be real. He reached the final lines and stopped, his breath catching just enough to remind him he was still here, still present. The message was simple, almost quiet in its certainty. It told him that what had been done here had mattered, even if no one had ever said it. It told him that some acts were not meant to be remembered by the world, only by the person who carried them. And it told him that if he had found his way back, it meant he was ready to carry it differently now, not as something hidden, but as something understood. Ethan lowered the letter slowly, his gaze drifting across the table, past the documents, past the key, settling somewhere beyond them as if looking at something only he could see. The fragments in his mind did not rush together. They did not overwhelm him, but they no longer felt distant. They felt close, like something just behind a door that had finally been unlocked. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching him, not with urgency, but with quiet reassurance, the kind that came from knowing the hardest part had already passed. Ethan exhaled, a long, steady breath that seemed to carry more than just air, something releasing, something shifting into place. He reached for the documents next, his movements calmer now, more certain, as though the path ahead was no longer something he needed to question. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees again, no longer hollow, no longer distant, but softer, like it had settled into a rhythm that matched the quiet inside the cabin. And in that stillness, Ethan understood something that had been just out of reach until now. The dog had not led him here to discover a secret. He had led him here to remember why it had been hidden in the first place. The documents felt different in Ethan's hands, not just in texture or weight, but in presence, as though they carried a kind of quiet authority that the letter had gently introduced but not fully revealed. He slid the top page free with care, the paper thicker than standard print, official in a way that did not need to announce itself. The edges were clean, preserved, untouched by the years that had settled over everything else in the cabin. His eyes moved across the first line slowly, not because the words were difficult to read, but because each one seemed to anchor itself deeper than expected. Names, coordinates, a designation that stirred something familiar in the back of his mind, like a sound heard long ago echoing faintly through time. He exhaled softly, his gaze narrowing just slightly as the fragments began to align, not fully, but enough to form the outline of something real. This was not just a record. It was a confirmation. The mission described in the document did not exist in any official archive. Yet here it was, detailed with precision, written with the clarity of someone who knew it mattered even if no one else ever acknowledged it. Ethan's fingers tightened subtly around the page, not in tension, but in grounding, as if he needed to feel something solid while everything inside him shifted. Rex remained still beside the table, his head resting gently on his front paws, his eyes half closed but aware, always aware, the kind of presence that did not need to move to be felt. Ethan turned to the next page. The details deepened. The location matched the forest surrounding the cabin. The timing aligned with a period of his life that had always felt incomplete, like a chapter that ended too abruptly to make sense. A signal received. A structure found. A decision made without orders, without witnesses, without recognition. His breath slowed again, that steady rhythm returning as the shape of the truth became clearer, not overwhelming, but undeniable. He did not need every detail to understand the weight of it. He had been here, not just physically, but purposefully. He had chosen this place when there was no one left to choose for him. His eyes moved to the final page. It was shorter, more concise, but somehow heavier than the rest. A formal statement, not signed by a superior, not stamped with authority, but written in the same hand as the letter, the same steady certainty. It acknowledged the mission not as an operation, but as an act carried out in silence, completed without recognition, and preserved not in records, but in memory. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not from strain, but from the quiet realization that followed. This had never been about what was hidden here. It had always been about why it was hidden. He lowered the documents slowly, placing them back on the table with the same care he had used to lift them. The small metallic key remained beside them, catching a thin line of gray light from the window, its surface reflecting just enough to draw his attention. He reached for it, lifting it between his fingers. It was simple, unmarked, but balanced, the kind of object designed for a single purpose. He turned it slightly, watching the way it caught the light, and felt that same subtle pull again, not from the object itself, but from what it pointed toward. His gaze shifted instinctively back toward the cabin, scanning the walls, the floor, the quiet structure that no longer felt like a place he had entered, but a place he had returned to. Rex lifted his head then, just slightly, his ears twitching as if catching something faint beyond the walls, something carried on the wind that had softened outside. He did not bark this time. He simply looked toward the far end of the cabin, his gaze steady, patient. Ethan followed that line of sight, his eyes settling on a narrow section near the back, partially shadowed, easily overlooked unless you knew to look for it. A third point, not hidden by complexity, but by simplicity. Ethan stood slowly, the chair behind him giving a soft creak as he rose. The key rested in his hand, light, certain. He took a step forward, then another, the distance closing not just in space, but in understanding. The cabin no longer felt like a place of questions. It felt like a place of answers waiting to be accepted. Rex remained where he was, watching, no longer leading, no longer guiding, but present, as if his role had shifted from direction to witness. Ethan reached the back wall and paused, his eyes scanning the surface, his hand lifting slightly as the same quiet instinct guided him again. There, just beneath the edge of a narrow shelf, was a small, precise keyhole, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He stared at it for a moment, the pieces aligning with a calm certainty that left no room for doubt. Some truths are not revealed all at once. They are given in layers, each one waiting for you to understand the last before you are allowed to see the next. The key felt lighter than it should have as Ethan brought it closer to the small, nearly invisible keyhole, its metal catching the faint gray light like it had been waiting for this exact alignment. His hand did not shake, but there was a quiet awareness in his movement, a precision that came not from hesitation, but from understanding that this moment was not about discovery anymore. It was about acceptance. He paused just before inserting the key, his eyes lingering on the narrow opening, the edges worn in a way that suggested it had been used before, but not often. Once, maybe twice. Enough to matter. Behind him, Rex remained still, his presence steady and grounded, no longer urging forward, no longer signaling, just watching with that same calm certainty that had guided them here. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and slid the key into place. It fit perfectly, not just in size, but in feeling, as though the motion completed something that had been left unfinished. He turned it gently. The mechanism responded with a soft, internal shift, followed by a deeper sound within the wall, something heavier moving into alignment. The wood beneath his hand vibrated faintly, not with force, but with purpose, like a system long dormant remembering how to function again. Then, slowly, a section of the wall released, not outward like a door, but inward, revealing a narrow passage just beyond the surface. The air that escaped from within was cooler, stiller, untouched, carrying with it a faint scent of stone and time. Ethan stood there for a moment, not stepping forward yet, allowing the space to reveal itself fully. The opening was just wide enough for one person to pass through, the interior dim, but not entirely dark. A faint, natural light filtered from somewhere deeper inside, enough to outline the edges of a small room carved into the structure behind the cabin. It was not large, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, but it was deliberate. Everything about it was deliberate. He stepped inside slowly, the transition from wood to stone subtle, but noticeable beneath his boots. The temperature dropped slightly, the quiet deepening into something more complete, like the outside world had been left behind entirely. In the center of the room stood a single object. A wooden chest, reinforced with metal edges, its surface worn but intact, positioned with the same careful intention as everything else in this place. There were no markings on it, no labels, no explanation. It did not need any. Ethan approached it with steady steps, his eyes fixed on its presence, his mind no longer searching for answers, but ready to receive them. He knelt beside it, placing one hand lightly on the lid. The wood was cool, but not cold, grounded, real. He paused again, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the weight of what this final layer might hold. Behind him, in the quiet of the main cabin, Rex shifted slightly, the soft sound of his movement carrying through the narrow opening, a reminder that he was still there, still present, still part of this moment even without stepping inside. Ethan lifted the lid. Inside, the contents were arranged with the same careful precision he had come to expect, but this time, the meaning was immediate. There was no need to interpret, no need to search. At the top lay a folded American flag, preserved perfectly, its fabric smooth, its presence unmistakable. Beneath it, a framed photograph rested flat, protected beneath a clear surface. Ethan's breath slowed as he reached for it, lifting it carefully into the light. The image was simple, but it struck deeper than anything else he had seen. A younger version of himself stood in front of this very cabin, his posture steady, his expression calm, but different, lighter in a way that time had since softened. Beside him stood Rex, younger as well, strong, uninjured, his ears high, his stance alert. And behind them, just visible in the background, the same forest stretched outward, unchanged, as if time had chosen to leave this place untouched while everything else moved on. Ethan stared at the photograph, his fingers tightening slightly around the frame, not from tension, but from the quiet impact of seeing what had once been real and had somehow been lost. This was not a place he had stumbled upon. This was a place he had built, chosen, and left behind. His gaze lowered back to the chest, where beneath the photograph and the flag lay a final item, a sealed document, thicker than the others, its surface marked with a single line in that same familiar handwriting. He did not open it yet. He did not need to. Not immediately. Because in that moment, standing in the quiet of the hidden room, with the past laid gently before him, Ethan understood something with a clarity he had not felt in years. Some journeys do not take you somewhere new. They bring you back to the place where you first decided who you were meant to be. The photograph remained steady in Ethan's hands long after he lowered himself to sit beside the chest, his back resting lightly against the cool stone wall as the quiet of the hidden room settled around him like something familiar rather than distant. He looked at it again, not searching for details this time, but allowing the image to exist as it was, a simple truth preserved in a way memory had failed to do. The man in the photograph was not a stranger, but he was not entirely the same man either. There was something in his posture, something in the way he stood beside Rex, that spoke of certainty, of a purpose that had not yet been buried under years of silence. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a quiet weight, not heavy, but grounding. He placed the photograph back into the chest with care, smoothing the edge of the folded flag above it, as though acknowledging something that did not need words. For a moment, he did nothing else. The stillness did not press against him anymore. It held him. Behind him, the faint sound of movement came from the cabin as Rex adjusted his position, the soft scrape of claws against wood carrying through the narrow passage. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, letting that sound anchor him, reminding him that he was not alone in this place, not in the present, and not in the past either. When he opened them again, his gaze settled on the final document resting at the bottom of the chest. He reached for it with steady hands, lifting it slowly, the paper firm, preserved, waiting. The same handwriting marked the surface, but this time, the words felt less like a message and more like a conclusion. He opened it carefully, unfolding the pages with the same deliberate care he had shown everything else, and began to read. The language was clear, direct, but carried a quiet warmth that had not been present in the earlier documents. It did not speak of missions or decisions. It spoke of ownership, not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of belonging. The cabin, the land surrounding it, the space hidden within it, all of it had been placed under his name, not as a reward, not as compensation, but as a continuation. A place to return to when the world beyond it became too loud, too distant, too heavy to carry alone. Ethan's eyes moved across the final lines, and something inside him settled in a way it had not in years. There was no sudden rush of memory, no overwhelming flood of realization, just a quiet alignment, like pieces that had always been connected finally resting where they belonged. He folded the document again and placed it back into the chest, closing the lid gently. The sound was soft, final, but not an ending. He stood, slowly, turning back toward the narrow passage that led into the cabin. As he stepped through, the transition from stone to wood felt different now, not like entering a place unknown, but like returning to something that had been waiting with patience rather than absence. Rex lifted his head as Ethan emerged, his eyes calm, his body relaxed, the tension that had guided him through the forest fully gone. Ethan walked over and knelt beside him, placing a hand gently along the dog's neck, his fingers resting there with quiet familiarity. "You remembered," he said softly, not as a question, but as an understanding. Rex's tail moved once against the floor, slow and steady, as if that was all the answer needed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, but it no longer sounded hollow. It carried something lighter now, something that did not pull, but stayed. Ethan stood and walked to the doorway, stepping out onto the porch as the forest stretched quietly before him. The air felt the same, but he did not. He was no longer searching for where to go next. He was standing in a place that had already chosen him once, and now he had chosen it back. And in that quiet exchange, something simple became clear. Not every home is built to be found. Some are built to wait, until the person who belongs there is finally ready to return.